Have you ever looked at the world and asked yourself, how is it that such obviously destructive ideas gain so much power? How do the most irrational, even absurd decisions become normalized and accepted? I have. And so did Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian and philosopher who resisted the Nazis and ultimately paid for it with his life. In one of his most haunting reflections, he didn't just talk about evil, he talked about stupidity. And he said something utterly shocking, that stupidity is more dangerous than evil. Let that sink in. Not malice, not cruelty, but stupidity. And today I want to explain why this one statement might be the key to understanding not only history, but our current world and even your role in it. To begin, we need to clarify what Bonhoeffer meant by stupidity. He wasn't talking about low IQ or lack of formal education. He wasn't mocking people. He was identifying a deeper, far more terrifying phenomenon, the voluntary surrender of one's inner autonomy. Stupidity, for Bonhoeffer, is not a lack of intellect, it's a failure of moral independence. It's when a person no longer thinks for themselves, but lets their mind be taken over by slogans, by crowds, by ideology. It's when you stop asking, is this true? And start asking, is this popular? Or worse, will I be safe if I say this? And in that moment, you don't just lose your mind, you lose your soul. Have you ever caught yourself agreeing with something, not because you believed it, but because you didn't want to be excluded?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Bonhoeffer observed this firsthand in Nazi Germany. He watched as ordinary people, neighbors, teachers, shopkeepers became complicit in unimaginable atrocities, not necessarily because they were evil, but because they had stopped thinking. They outsourced their conscience to the state, to the party, to propaganda. And that's what makes stupidity so dangerous. It doesn't argue. It doesn't reason. It just repeats. It becomes immune to facts because it never engaged with them in the first place. And in that state, a person becomes not just unhelpful but harmful. Bonhoeffer writes, "Against stupidity, we are defenseless." Why? Because you can protest evil, expose it, fight it. But stupidity doesn't even recognize the argument. It's like yelling at a wall that thinks it's a mirror. Let's bring this home. In our world today, are we not surrounded by this very form of stupidity? Think about how misinformation spreads not through rigorous debate, but through uncritical repetition. Think about how complex issues are reduced to hashtags, how people define themselves by what side they're on before they even understand the issue. The most dangerous movements in history weren't led by monsters, they were enabled by the silent, the obedient, the unthinking. And this is where you and I must be brutally honest with ourselves. Have we, in small ways, become stupid? Not in intellect, but in courage. How often do we choose comfort over truth? Consensus over conscience? Bonhoeffer's warning isn't just philosophical, it's practical. Because stupidity scales. It spreads through institutions, media, politics. And once it takes hold, it doesn't just tolerate evil, it protects it. It provides cover. It justifies it. It means a stupid society becomes a fertile ground where evil can flourish without resistance. And that's why this matters. Because if we want to stand against real injustice, we don't just need to fight evil, we need to awaken thought. We need to restore the inner independence of people. We need to ask the hard questions, even when they cost us. So I'm asking you now, when was the last time you changed your mind, not because someone told you to, but because you thought deeply and honestly? When was the last time you risked being excluded in order to be right? This is the beginning of a much deeper journey, one that will disturb you, maybe even offend you, but also awaken you. Because Bonhoeffer's insight isn't just historical, it's eternal. It's a mirror held up to every generation, including ours. And if we want to be on the right side of history, not just in public, but in private, we have to understand how stupidity works inside us, how it seduces us, how it hides behind good intentions, and how we can break free from it. Let's dig deeper into this terrifying insight. Stupidity becomes more dangerous than evil precisely because it disguises itself as harmless. It doesn't wear a villain's face. It smiles. It nods. It blends in. And that's what makes it so hard to detect, especially when it lives inside us. Bonhoeffer noticed that stupidity grows not primarily in isolation, but in groups. He says, stupidity is not an intellectual defect, but a human one. It's a social phenomenon. It thrives where there is conformity, fear, and blind loyalty. And the moment an individual stops thinking critically and starts surrendering their judgment to the collective, they become capable of enabling evil without even realizing it. That's what makes collective stupidity a force more dangerous than any dictator. It makes tyranny look like teamwork. Now imagine this, a society in which millions of people obey rules they don't understand, repeat slogans they haven't questioned, and support policies they haven't examined just because it feels safer than standing alone. Does that sound familiar? It should, because we live in that world. We're surrounded by it every day on our feeds, in our institutions, even in our relationships. And here's the scary part. The stupid person, as Bonhoeffer puts it, is often more self-satisfied than the malicious one. Why? Because they are shielded by the herd. They don't feel guilty. They don't feel responsible. They feel normal. But what happens when normal becomes the mask of madness? This is where the danger escalates. Evil, when it acts alone, can be identified, resisted, and condemned. But stupidity, when embedded in the masses, becomes systemic. It becomes law. It becomes culture. And suddenly, the person who dares to question it, who dares to shout, "This is wrong," isn't seen as courageous. They're seen as dangerous, troublemaker, dissenter, conspiracy theorist, or simply crazy. This is how truth dies, not in some dramatic collapse, but in the slow suffocation of thought. And you have to ask yourself, in a world that punishes questioning, are you still willing to think? Bonhoeffer knew the cost. He didn't resist stupidity from a safe distance. He resisted from within Nazi Germany, where to think differently was a death sentence. And yet, he chose truth over safety. He chose conscience over comfort. He chose to see even when most people were choosing to look away. So ask yourself right now, what are you choosing not to see? What have you accepted, repeated, or tolerated not because you believe it, but because it's easier? Because it's safer? Because everyone else is doing it? That's how stupidity becomes dangerous, not when it's loud, but when it becomes normal. And here's the most terrifying part of all. Stupidity doesn't just support evil, it makes intelligent resistance almost impossible. Bonhoeffer writes, "The stupid person is often stubborn, and being confronted with facts does not help." Why? Because stupidity isn't about logic. It's about identity. It's about fear. It's about belonging. To challenge a stupid idea is to threaten the person's entire social framework. So they double down. Not because they're dumb, but because they're scared. And now we have to ask the hardest question of all. Are we brave enough to think? Not just privately, but publicly. Not just when it's safe, but when it's dangerous. This is the invisible power of the unthinking majority. They don't burn books, they just stop reading them. They don't silence truth, they just drown it in noise. They don't kill the thinkers, they just ignore them until they disappear. And that, my friends, is how stupidity becomes more dangerous than evil. Because it doesn't just make room for evil, it makes resistance feel futile. So here we are, face to face with Bonhoeffer's haunting truth. Stupidity, left unchecked, becomes not just a weakness, but a weapon. And this weapon is often wielded unknowingly, which makes it all the more effective and all the more terrifying. But now comes the turning point. If stupidity is more dangerous than evil, what do we do about it? How do we fight something that wears no uniform, carries no flag, and often lives inside the people we love or even inside ourselves? The answer is not violence. It's not argument. It's not humiliation. The answer, Bonhoeffer suggests, is awakening. A reawakening of moral responsibility. A restoration of thinking, not just as a skill, but as a sacred act. You see, the greatest resistance to stupidity is not cleverness, it's courage. The courage to stand alone in a room full of people repeating the same lie. The courage to say, "I don't know," when everyone else pretends to have the answers. The courage to ask a question so dangerous that it breaks the illusion of certainty. That's the revolution we need, not a political one, but an inner revolt against the pressure to conform. And that begins with you. Yes, you, because the battle against stupidity isn't fought in grand speeches, it's fought in small moments. When you choose to listen instead of react, when you read instead of scroll, when you apologize instead of attack. Those are acts of rebellion in a stupid age. And here's where it gets even more personal. Bonhoeffer believed that stupidity is not an inherent flaw, it's a moral failure. Meaning? It's a choice, not always conscious, but always present. We become stupid when we allow fear, laziness, or comfort to silence our inner voice. And we become wise when we reclaim that voice, even when it's trembling. So I ask you now, what voices have you silenced in yourself? What truths have you buried for the sake of peace? What questions have you refused to ask because the answers might cost you something? This is not about blaming others. This is about waking up before it's too late. Because here's the ultimate irony: in resisting stupidity, we risk being called stupid. But when you challenge the herd turns on you. When you think deeply in a shallow world, you'll be mocked, misunderstood, maybe even hated. But that is the cost of clarity, the cost of conscience. Bonhoeffer paid that price with his life. But he didn't die a fool. He died a free man. And his words live on not because they were loud, but because they were true. So I ask you one final, impossible question. If truth cost you everything, would you still choose it? That's the legacy we're invited into, not just to admire Bonhoeffer from a distance, but to embody his vision, and to resist stupidity with thought, to fight evil with reflection, to reclaim our minds not as weapons, but as sanctuaries. Because when we think, really think, we don't just protect ourselves, we protect each other. We become less manipulable, less reactive, less dangerous. So the next time you hear something repeated 1,000 times, stop, ask, reflect. And maybe, just maybe, we can shift the tide not by shouting louder, but by thinking deeper. In a world where stupidity has become systemic, your ability to think clearly is nothing short of revolutionary. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, you are already part of the resistance. Not the loud kind, the deep kind. And that's exactly what the world needs now more than ever.